In the previous lecture, we have described our first API path with the help of OpenAPI specification. Like you can see here, we have followed the same structure that we have discussed previously. Under paths, we have defined a path called /categories. Under this endpoint path, we have mentioned what is the HTTP method type. So since in our case, it's a GET, we have mentioned the GET. Under GET, we have to implement the operation object. So the operation object structure is, what is the summary, what is the description, which we have mentioned. Request body we have skipped since it is a GET method. Under responses, we have defined the response object structure for the HTTP code 200. So whenever we are trying to describe our response, definitely we need to mention the fields description and content, followed by what is the content type. And inside that we need to mention the schema and what is the type of your response. Is it an array or object or string? So those kind of details we have mentioned by following the same hierarchy that you are seeing on the screen. We just not use the operation ID. So operation ID I will discuss towards the end of the course. The purpose of operation ID is trying to give a name to your entire operation object. It has some significance whenever you try to generate a server-side code with the help of OpenAPI specification. So we can discuss that when we are discussing about the code generation with the help of OpenAPI specification. So now let's try to understand how this is going to look like inside my Swagger UI. Definitely we can't force someone to simply look at my OpenAPI specification YAML file and try to understand the information. So that's a kind of very rude. Let's try to be friends with our consumers. So what we can do, our consumers, is you can explore the Swagger UI and you can try to understand my API very easily. So what they have to do is they have to scroll down on this page, and if you can see here, there is an API with the name categories. So we need to click on that. So when you click on that, it will further open. So you can click and open multiple times, but let me drag this towards the left hand side so that we can see this properly. So now here you can see, don't worry about this default. By default, OpenAPI specification will put all your APIs under the name default, but we are going to discuss in the coming lectures how we can group our APIs. Like if I click on this default, it will close all the APIs under it. So we're going to discuss this, but for now our API is listed under default. That should be fine. And the API name is /categories of type HTTP GET. And this is the summary, list all categories. And this is the description. So someone can click on that, it will close. And if they click on that, it will open. So now there are no input parameters for my categories path. So that's why these parameters are empty, and there is no request structure also. That's why there is no request structure here inside this UI. Coming to responses, you can see for response code 200, which is a success code, the description is list of categories and the media type is application/JSON. So similarly, we can mention the XML, any number of media types here. For now, we're just supporting the JSON. So that's why the dropdown shows only one value. Now here, if you scroll down further, you can click on the schema, and if you expand the schema, you can see this is a JSON representation because we are going to return the media type as JSON. So inside JSON, the array is represented with the square brackets. That's why you can see opening square bracket and closing square bracket here. And inside this array, we are going to have multiple objects, and inside each of this object, we are going to have an category ID of type integer, and the next value is name of type string. And if you click on this example value, it is also going to show you how an sample response is going to look like. So by default, for integer, the example value, the OpenAPI specification is going to consider is 0. And for name, it is going to consider the string. So in future, I'm going to explain you how we can make our examples looks like very professional with the actual or test data values. For now, I hope you are getting a sense like how helpful the Swagger UI is, even if someone is not too technical like our QA persons or business analysts, they can easily understand, like they don't need further explanations. So this way we can define the responses for any number of codes. So if you want to mention the response code for 500, you just have to repeat this entire structure one more time with the code as 500. And similarly, if you want to mention the content type for XML, you just have to repeat this whole content one more time with the content name as application/XML. So that's how easy it is. Once you start using this, I'm sure like you're going to like it and your work is going to be super easy. So with this, I'm assuming you are super clear about the basic path that we have created so far. So this is the first happy path that we have achieved inside our course. Kudos to your efforts. Before the next lecture, my recommendation is try to do some hands-on. You try to introduce a path with your own path name, same get method. Try to define all these values. Make sure you are comfortable with that YAML tab spacing structure or indentation. So that's the only thing that you need to be very careful here. Otherwise, you will keep getting compilation errors. And of course, the Swagger editor is there to keep you always on toes. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now in this lecture, let's try to explore how to describe query parameters inside OpenAPI specification. Like you can see here, first we have built an API that supports HTTP GET. So inside HTTP GET, we can also pass the query parameters. So what do I mean by query parameters? So using query parameters, we can send the filtering criteria inside the URL itself. Like you can see here, this is the URL where we have a base path till v1. Post that, our path will get appended, which is /categories. And after that, I need to mention a query param, which is category ID is equal to 1. So this means my API, instead of returning all the categories available inside the EG shop, it is going to return the details of the category ID, which I am providing inside my query parameters. So this is what we are going to achieve inside this lecture. I hope you are clear. So the same we can represent inside our OpenAPI specification very easily. For the same, what we have to do is, like the query parameters belongs to the request section. That's why what we have to do is just after description and just before the responses, we need to provide a field name called parameters, because I'm going to pass input parameters or request parameters. That's why the name parameters. And since I can send any number of parameters, it's not only one parameter, I can send 2 or 3 or any number of query parameters. So that's why it accepts an array of parameters. So whenever I want to mention my parameter details, I need to start with hyphen. So once we provide this hyphen, which indicates an list elements under parameters, we need to provide what is the name of your parameter that you are going to pass. Like we saw previously, the name of the parameter is category ID. And since this is an array, this positioning doesn't matter. So I can make it more inside as well so that it looks better. Once we define the name of the parameter, we need to mention where this parameter is going to come. Is this going to come inside the query parameters or path params or in the headers, cookies? So these are the valid values. So that's why we need to be very clear, like where we want to send this parameter. So for the same, we need to give IN, which indicates in which place we want to send it. So like you can see here, the valid values are the allowed values for in under parameters is path, query, header, and cookie. So since we want to send as a query parameter, we need to provide the value as query here. And after that, we need to mention what is the type of your category ID. Is it a string? Is it a number? Is it an object? Since we want to describe our category ID type, we need to mention this schema like we used under response. Very similarly, wherever we want to describe our object or input or response request, so in all those scenarios we have to use this schema. So once we define this schema, I need to mention the type of the schema. Is it an object? Is it an integer? So in this scenario, since it is a simple input, I'm going to make it as an integer instead of an object. So with that, the story is completed because we don't want to further explain our schema. The reason is it is a simple data type. It's not a complex data type like an array or an object. And of course, we can also mention other attributes like required, like I can mention whether it is an required true or false, which means whether it is a mandatory input or an optional input. So for this scenario, I'm going to remove this because I want to use the same categories API in two forms. One, if someone is not sending the category ID, I'm going to return all the categories that I have inside the Easy Shop. Otherwise, if I have a valid category ID, I'm going to return the details of that particular category only. So that's why I'm going to remove this. And we can also define the boundaries for your integer here. Like I can use minimum like 100 and maximum like 1000. So this way I can define the boundaries for my category IDs as well. But please make sure, since I'm explaining these boundaries for the type integer, this minimum and maximum has to be present in the same line where my type is present. So with this, we have successfully mentioned the query parameters for our API path categories. So let's try to check how this is looking like inside my Swagger UI. So for the same, I'm scrolling down here. So now you can see here under parameters, we have a name, category ID. The description is empty. If I want, I can provide description as well, just after name by using the description field. But for now, that's fine. We can ignore because this is self-explanatory. So now it is clearly showing like this category ID is an of type integer, which is going to accept as a query parameter. And this usually represents what is the sample example value. Here, since we have not mentioned anything, it is simply showing whatever is the query param name. So what we can do is just after schema, we can provide the example by using the example field, and we can give some example value saying that like maybe 101. So now you can see the same value is being shown under this text field. So this indicates someone can send a query param of type integer and example value is 101. So now we have successfully defined the input query parameters with the help of OpenAPI specification. I know you might have a question here. What is the option that we have here? Try it out. So I don't want to hold your question, or I don't want to hold your anxiety. So let's discuss about the same in the next lecture. Thank you. Bye. So now in this lecture, let's explore this beautiful button that we have inside Swagger UI, which is try it out. Don't ask me, is it beautiful or not? Because according to me, anything that is making our lives easy is beautiful. That's why I call it as beautiful button. So enough of talking, let's jump into try it out. So the purpose of this try it out option that we have inside the Swagger UI is sometimes we want to quickly test the APIs based upon the details that we have provided inside the OpenAPI specifications. Usually what developers or QA or business analyst or any person, what they will do is they will try to test with the help of browser or with the help of Postman or with the help of code. So instead of you looking for other options, so this has an inbuilt try it out option. So whenever you click on this try it out, you will have this input enable. Like since in this scenario, we have only query parameter of type integer, it is showing only one input parameter. If you have HTTP post which accepts the request body, it will also show you the request body to enter. We'll be exploring that in coming lectures. But for now, let's try it out with this path, which is categories. So here category ID by default, the example value is 101. If I want, I can change it to 200. And if I click on this execute, what will happen is it is going to send a request to the server. Like you can see, it has given a sample curl command as well, but this is the request URL that it is trying to form. So this base URL is coming from my server's information, and to the same it appended this categories, which is my API path. And since we are using query parameters, it appended this question mark and provided my parameter, which is category ID, and the value that I'm passing, which is 200. Obviously you'll get an error response. The reason is we don't have this API server and we don't have any real server with this name. But in real world, think of a scenario, a serious provider or serious product API developer who has a valid server details, it will work with this execute button and you'll get a sample response. And since we didn't document for this error, it is showing code as undocumented. The details is load failed. So this is the purpose of try it out on the Swagger UI. And if you click on this clear, everything will get clear and you can change the value again. And here I know you may have a question. The question is, you have given a minimum and maximum. Can we try that? I like it. I like that question. So let's try it out. So the maximum value that we have here is 1000. So let me give my favorite number, which is all nines. So now if I try to click on the execute, you can see my Swagger UI itself is not accepting because it is not within the range of minimum and maximum that I have provided. The same kind of validation will happen even inside the code as well whenever you use the OpenAPI specification to generate your server-side code. So all this will be taken care by these automation tools. The only thing that you have to do is you have to beautifully describe all these requirements inside your OpenAPI specification. So if I click on this cancel, everything will go away. So now let me click on this try it out. So this time I will just try with different input number. This time I'm going to ask you, what is the number that you want me to give here? I got it. So you want me to give 115. So let me click on this execute here, and you can see again it failed, but the only thing that I want you to observe here is the request URL formation with the category ID is equal to 115. If there is a valid server URL, definitely you are going to get a valid response. So this is all about this try it out option. I'll be showing you multiple times in the course whenever we are exploring the various flavors of APIs. So don't worry if you're not clear about how to use this during the post operation and how to use this whenever we have to use some security details like username, password. So all those scenarios we are going to discuss inside this course. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now is the time for assignment. So in this lecture, I'm going to give an assignment and I'm going to explain you the requirements of this assignment. I want you to give a shot and I want you to describe the API with the help of OpenAPI specification based upon the requirements that I'm going to share. So like you can see here, as of now, we have only one get path with the name categories, and this supports query param, which is of type optional. So now what I want to do is we can build a new path that supports the path parameters. Just like how we can have query params, we can also have path parameters. So I can share more details about what do I mean by path params. So whenever we are trying to adopt the path params, how our API path is going to look like is, so this is a sample URL which is adopting the path params. Like you know, the highlighted URL is the base URL, and after that this is the API path name like categories, and after categories I can have a path param value like 101 or 102. It can be any dynamic value that my consumers can send. So what I have to do is, in order to describe this kind of API paths, I need to mention a placeholder after categories, and I need to describe that placeholder, what is the value that they can send, what is the data type of that value. So all these details we need to describe with the help of OpenAPI specification. And believe me, this is super simple if you already followed the previous lectures. So what we have to do is we just have to introduce one more path. So whenever we are trying to introduce one more API path, please make sure you are in the same line where your slash categories started. Like you can see both my slash categories and the cursor right now in the same line. So here what I can do is I can introduce a new path saying that slash categories, and after that I need to give one more slash, and I need to mention a placeholder value with the name category ID. So this is just a placeholder name, and this name can be anything, but we just have to make sure the same placeholder name we are using inside the parameters configurations that we are going to do. So I hope you are clear, like what as a next step you have to do is you just have to define the same get, summary, description. Under the parameters, instead of query, what you have to do is you just have to mention the path, because the valid values inside in is path, query, header, cookie. Query we already tried in the previous lectures. Now since we are trying to implement the path params as an input, you just have to mention the path as a value in the place of query, and remaining everything is going to same. In the response, instead of we returning an array of categories, we can return an object of category, because we always knows like for this kind of path where someone is sending the category ID, they'll always get only single category object but not the array of categories. So due to that reason, inside the responses, what you have to do is for 200 response code, you just have to define the schema as an object but not the array. So for the same, the solution is very simple. You just have to avoid this type array and items. You can directly start with type as an object and you can explain the properties inside that object. So this is going to be super simple, but please note that whenever we are using the param as an value inside the parameters in field, we just have to make sure the required field is true. Like you just have to mention required as true because that makes sense, right? Like whenever you're using path parameters inside your URL, the placeholder value should be a mandatory value. Otherwise, there is no meaning for your API path. So due to that reason, your OpenAPI specification also will throw an error saying that required is equal to true is mandatory for path input parameters. So this is an heads up that I want to give. So let me revert this required is equal to true here. This is not needed. So now I hope you are clear like what is the assignment. Please take your time and you can download this version of the file from the GitHub location, and on top of that try to describe a new API path that support path input parameters. So please put your efforts in solving this assignment. Even if you are facing 100 different of errors, don't worry, keep doing that and you will come to know 100 different ways how to overcome your OpenAPI specification problems. So in the process, you will become a master. And believe me, during my journey of OpenAPI specification, I have done thousands of mistakes. So don't get demotivated. In the next lecture, we can discuss the solution of this assignment. Thank you and bye. I hope you are successful at solving the assignment. If not, don't worry. We are going to discuss the solution now inside this lecture. You can compare the solution with what you have and what we are discussing and correct your solution so that your solution also will become perfect. So now here the job is very easy. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the content present inside the categories, all this content, and I'm going to paste this just under the new API path by giving a tab space. So I have pasted that. So now here we have to make certain changes. So here the very first change that we have to do is we just have to change the value against this in field from query to path. So that's the very first change that we have to do. As soon as you make this change, you will see on the right hand side you are getting an error saying that whenever we are using this path as an input, the required property is required. So it's very funny message. The required property is required. So it's like tongue twister. So what it is saying is you just have to define the required attribute. And let me do that like required. First, I'll try to mention false. So then again, it is going to throw another error saying that whenever we are defining the path parameters, the allowed values for required is always true. So this is how the Swagger editor will always keep you corrected. It will always complain along with the what are the valid values, how to fix that. So that's the beauty of using Swagger editor. I can do the same job by using a notepad or some text editor, but that's going to be very tough because no one will be there helping you to correct for any compilation issues. So here let me correct this required as true. So now the error should be resolved. So the very next things that we need to correct here is first let's make sure everything is correct. Summary is making sense, and description we can say like returns the list of categories supported by Easy Shop. That also makes sense. So since we want to have the path parameters, we need to make sure we are mentioning these parameters, and since I can mention any number of parameters, this hyphen has to be there indicating that this is one of the list element under the parameters. So the parameter name that I want to follow for my path params is category ID. The same name has to be present inside this placeholder. So if you try to make it different, then definitely you will get an error. So let's make sure that both placeholder name value that you have mentioned here, the same name is matching here under the name field. And next under this in field, we need to make sure we are passing the path as a value since we want to go with the path params. And definitely, as I said, required has to be true. And next, since we have to describe what is the type of the category ID, is it an object, is it an integer, or is it a string? So that's why we need to use this schema whenever we want to explain the type of our data. So the type is integer, the minimum value I want to support here is 100, the maximum is 1000, and example here, let's make it to 102 just for fun. So here you can see the example is not present inside the schema, because whatever example value that I am trying to convey here, this is applicable to this param, which is category ID. So that's why the example is present on the same line location where the schema is present. So please make a note of it. And after that, once we are satisfied with the parameters, like everything is correct on the parameter side, we just have to define how our response structure is going to look like. So for the same, we just have to start with the responses. And after that, since we can define response structures for various response codes, for now we are going to declare only for the 200 response code, which indicates successful response. So that's why I'm not going to change anything here. I'll just keep it as 200. Description also will remain the same. And after that, we just have to mention this content. What is the content format that I'm going to follow is application/JSON. So that's why we have to give this value. And now, since we have to describe how our response schema is going to look like whenever I follow JSON, so that's why we need to give this schema keyword here. And after that, since we decided to not use the array but only as an object, what we can do is we can remove this type array. And whenever we are using array, we have to use items. Since we are not going to use the array, we can remove these items as well. So if I remove that, I can bring all this content before few spaces, like I can move them before. So now you can see under schema, I have a type of object. And since I have mentioned the object as my type, I need to mention the properties inside my object. So definitely the object properties has to be similar to the another API which we have declared, because they both has to return the same data, which is categories data. So the properties are category ID of type integer, and the next one is name is the property name of type string. So with this, we have successfully defined another API which is supporting the path params. And you can also see the same inside this Swagger UI. So let me drag this towards the left so that you can see clearly. So you can see this is how it is going to look like. And if I click on this, you can see now, since it is required, it is showing that asterisk mark with an red highlighted font. So this clearly indicates to my consumers, always pass this category ID inside your path, otherwise you are not going to get a valid response. So the example value is being displayed here, and the response also it is displaying, like this is how 200 response structure is going to look like. Now if you go and check the schema, it is not an array, it's just an object which has category ID and name of type integer and string respectively. So I know you have an question here, like we want to see how the try it out is going to work in this scenario. So let me click on this try it out. So now first let me give something like outside the boundary of my minimum and maximum. So I have given 4 5s. So let me click on this execute. So it is not accepting. So this is working perfectly. So the valid value here that I want to give is 105. So now if I click on this execute, so you can see the request URL, this is how it is going to look like. My 105 is coming as part of path. So that's why we call them as path parameters. Whereas query parameters, they will come with question mark, ampersands appended to your URL. So the same you can see inside the curl command also. And of course, response, you will not get a valid response because this is not a valid working server URL. So with this, we have successfully described another API that is supporting path parameters with the help of OpenAPI specification. Kudos to you and my appreciations to you if you have solved the assignment without looking at this video. But if you followed this video and corrected your solution, don't worry, you will get more and more chances in the coming lectures where you can do practice based upon the assignments that we are going to discuss. So with this, I hope you are clear like how to describe path input parameters also with the help of OpenAPI specification. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now is the time to enhance our OpenAPI specification further by introducing more APIs. As of now, we have only 2 APIs which help us in getting the list of categories that are supported by the Easy Shop. So using these categories, maybe my consumer can have a home page where they can show the list of categories or departments where my end user can do shopping. So you can imagine a home page with multiple tiles like mobiles, laptops, headphones. So that home page my consumers can build based upon the response that they are getting from these categories APIs. So once my consumers displayed the home page to the end user saying that these are the categories that you can do shopping, the very next action that my end user they can do is they can click on one of the categories, like they can click on the mobiles or laptops. And when my end user click on that specific category, banner or image, my consumer has to display all the products that can be shopped by my end user. Like if someone click on the mobiles banner, it has to display all the mobiles inside the UI to my end user. So for the same, Easy Shop also has a solution. It is going to support certain APIs to get the list of products based upon category, or it can also support to return all the products along with the category details. And it also supports an API where if someone is sending the product ID, it is going to return the details of a particular product. So this is a sequence of actions like my end user can do. Like first he can land onto the home page where my consumer can show various banners like mobiles, laptop, headphones, televisions. So once my end user click on one of the banner like mobiles, my consumer has to display all the products that my end user can do shopping. And if my end user decided on one product, he can click on that where he can go to the product details page, and whenever he has to land on the products details page, my consumer has to make a API call to the Easy Shop to get more details about it. So for all these kind of actions, definitely my Easy Shop has to have two more APIs. The third API that we are going to develop here is /products. Like if someone is going to invoke this API, it is going to return all the products that are available inside Easy Shop. And for this products API, we can also have one query param where if some consumer is sending the category ID as an query param, then I'm going to return only the products related to that particular category instead of returning all the products of all categories. So that's what we are going to achieve in the third API. And the fourth API is very similar to the second API that we have developed, like category/category ID with the path param. So very similarly, we are going to develop the product/product ID with the path param. So what this fourth API will do is, if someone sending a request with the /products along with the product ID, it is going to return the details of that particular product. So these are the next APIs that we are going to develop, and this is going to be super similar to what we have done for the first two APIs. So here I want you also to try and give a shot before you try to jump into the next video and try to understand the structure of this OpenAPI specification for these two APIs. The only question that you might have here for these two APIs in order to implement by yourself is how the product object is going to look like. Like for category object, we have a category ID and a name. So very similarly, you may have a question, how can I envision the product object structure? So for the same, I'm going to show you the structure of the product object. So like you can see here, the product object can have properties like product ID, which is of type integer, and name, which describe what is the product name, and the price. So price has to support the decimal values. So whenever we want to support decimal values inside the OpenAPI specification, instead of integer, we have to mention the type as number. So we're going to discuss that. So don't worry. So please mention the number whenever you want to use the decimal values inside your OpenAPI specification. And next is category name, which indicates what is the category this product belongs to. Like whatever OnePlus 10 Pro 5G that I'm telling, this belongs to the mobiles category. That's why the category name has to be string. And the quantity, which indicates what is the quantity of the stock that Easy Shop right now has. So if this quantity is 0, then definitely my consumer, they can't sell it. They just have to disable the checkout option. So that's why this quantity also is useful information to the consumer. So again, this has to be an integer. So this is the structure of product. So with this, you have all the details. It's just that you have to understand the first two APIs. Very similarly, you can try the third and fourth APIs as well. The only challenge here is you have to build the product object structure inside your response schema. So please put your efforts. If you're not able to do it, that's fine. We are going to discuss this in detail in the next lecture. Thank you. Bye. Now in this lecture, let's try to describe the product related APIs using OpenAPI specification based upon the discussion that we had in the previous lecture. If you are successful at implementing by your own, that's great. But if you have some challenges, don't worry. We are going to repeat the exercise one more time in this lecture so that you can become a master at it. So here, like you can see, the third API that we want to describe is /products. So what I can do is I can just close the second API that we have so that I can refer the categories API while we are building the products API. So let me close these responses as well. So first what we have to do is we just have to give an enter and tab space, and we need to mention what is the HTTP method type. So here also the HTTP method type is get, because it is going to return the list of product details. So that's why we have to use get here. So if you are interested about post, update and delete, don't worry, please hold your excitement. We are going to discuss them also in the coming lectures. So now what I can do is I can mention the summary. What is a summary about this API? So the summary that I'm going to mention here is just, it will list all products. So next, after summary, we just have to mention the description, and for descriptions, I want to use the multiple lines to explain my description. So that's why I'm going to give this pipe symbol, and after that I can mention the description in multiple lines. So what I can do here is I can just copy the upper description that we have for categories, and I can mention the same. So here what I can do is I can just mention return the list of products supported by Easy Shop. So this is what I can mention here. So to make it work, I just have to give this tab space. So now you can see this entire text has converted into an green. So that indicates whatever highlighted in the green, all that value will get converted against to this description. So that's a YAML syntax that we need to follow. And of course, we are free to mention all this value inside a single line also. But if you want to maintain your description in multiple lines, you can follow this pipe symbol. So once we define this description, then like we were discussing previously, we want to define a parameters as well, which is an optional. Like if someone is passing this category ID as a query parameter, then I'm going to return the list of products supported by that particular category ID. Whereas if this category ID is not available inside my query param, then I'm going to return all the products that are supported by all the categories inside the Easy Shop. So the job is very simple. You just have to copy these entire parameters and just mention the same just after the description by following the same line position like description. So like you can see here, this is what I have pasted. The query param name will be the same like category ID, and the in will be query again. The schema we're mentioning because we want to describe the data type of our query param, which is category ID. The type is integer, and this is the minimum and maximum, and this is the example. So after this, we just have to mention the responses. So for the same, what we have to do is just in the same position where we have parameters, we just have to start the responses. And the responses, since we can define the response for multiple response codes, we have to provide the response code here for which you are trying to explain your response structure. So here I will just mention the 200. And after this, what we can do is if you can expand these responses under the categories API, you will see once we define this 200, we have to define the description, content, what is the content type, what is the schema. So we can in fact copy this entire structure, and I'll take that and I'll mention just after 200. So here you can see I have the description. So I just have to mention a list of products, and after that content is again application/JSON. The schema again, it is of type array, And since we are mentioning type as arrays, we have to mention these items. And inside the items, we need to explain what is the type of our item. So the type I'm giving an object so that I can define multiple properties. So the properties, the very first property that we have is product ID. So that's what I'm going to mention here. And after the product ID, the next property that we have is name of type string. So it is matching. Post name, we have the property with the name price. So the price has to support decimal values. So that's why I'm giving the type as number. So the number inside OpenAPI specification supports decimal, whereas integer supports only the whole numbers without decimal values. So let me check the product object structure. So here after product ID, name, price, we have category name, and after that we have quantity. So let's define the same also. So the next property we have here is category name, and the type is string. So let me mention the type as string. And after the category name, we have quantity. So I'm just going to mention the same. And the type of the quantity is of integer. So with this, we have successfully completed the OpenAPI specification for the API products. So let's quickly do the same for other API, which is product ID as a placeholder inside the API path. So this indicates that we have to use the path params as an input. So this is also going to be super easy. So what I can do is I'm going to copy this entire content here, and I will just paste after this API path. So here after copying the content, what we have to do is we can correct the summary. So instead of list all products, return product details. So that's what I can mention. And the description also I can mention something like returns the product details from Easy Shop. So that's what I can mention here. So now instead of category ID, we want to have the product ID. So let me copy the same here under the name of the parameters. And the input type is not query, it is path. So I have mentioned the same. And whenever we mention the path, we just have to mention one value. What is that? Yes, it is required. And do you remember what is the mandatory value that we need to follow here? Yes, it is true. So now the parameter section is completed. Now if you go to the responses for 200, the description we can change saying that return product details, and the content is application JSON only, and the schema here it can be type as an object because we are always going to return a single object details since my consumer is sending the product ID. So I can remove this type array and items. So with that I can bring this entire object before, so that this is going to look like perfect. So here you can see the type is object, and we are going to use the same properties like product ID, name, price, category name, and quantity. So successfully we have implemented the third and fourth APIs as well. So in the process of defining them, I realized the summary and description here is wrong for the second API. So here also we have to mention something like return category details. So let me mention the same for description also. Return the category details from Easy Shop. So let me mention the same under the responses description also. It is going to return the category details but not the list of categories. So I have corrected that. Now I'm super happy because I corrected an issue. So now let's try to see the Swagger UI. So how it is looking like. So if you see total, there are 4 APIs, and this is going to be super similar like categories. So under products, we have an query param, which is not mandatory. And the example value also we have mentioned 101. Now coming to the responses, this is how it is going to look like. If you click on the schema also, it is an array of products, and each product object will have product ID, name, price, category name, quantity, and price. Please make sure you are using the number, not integer. After this, you can also check the last API that we have, which is the products with the path parameter. So since it's a mandatory, it is showing this required in a red font. And similarly for response of this API, it is going to be only one product object details, which has product ID, name, price, category name, and quantity. So with this, we have successfully implemented total 4 APIs. And in the process, I'm assuming you got enough practice of defining API paths inside OpenAPI specification by following the structure that OpenAPI expects from us. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. As of now, inside our OpenAPI specification, we have described 4 APIs. So using these 4 APIs, any consumer, they can consume these APIs and they can display the categories and product details in their websites. So now think of a scenario, one of the end user who is using my consumer website, they liked one of the product, maybe they liked one of the mobile that my consumer is displaying with the data from the EG shop. And now my end user decided to buy that product by placing an order. So in order to support this new scenario, I want to introduce new API with the name orders, which will support HTTP post, because my consumers, they want to place a new order, which means it has to create some new data inside the EG shop. So whenever we are trying to create new records, we have to use the HTTP post. Whereas whenever we are trying to display or get the existing data, we just have to use the HTTP GET. So this is the standard that we need to follow. So now inside this lecture, let's try to build this new API. So for the same, what I can do is I can scroll this entire UI thing to right hand side so that we'll have lot space on the editor. And next thing what I can do is I can close all these paths that we have so that we'll get some space here. And I can also close this info object, servers object. So now what I can do is I can just start a new path. So whenever we want to describe a new path inside our paths, we have to start with a forward slash followed by what is the path name. So the path name is orders. So after mentioning the path name, I'm going to give a colon and press enter and give tab space. Like we're discussing, the HTTP method that it is going to support here is post. So let's give the same like post here, then press enter and give tab space. And once we give this information, we have to provide the summary and description of our API. So I'm going to mention the same here. So like you can see here, the summary is create order and the description is post order details to EG shop for processing and shipping. So that's a description. And once we mention this summary and description, since this is an HTTP post API, obviously we have to send the data inside the request. So here the parameters are not supported because this is an HTTP post. So we can ignore the parameter section and we can start a new section related to request body. So here we have to give request body just in the same position where we have summary description. So once we give this request body, press enter and give a space. And after this, we have to mention the content, since we are going to describe the content of our request. So once we mention this content, we need to mention what is the type of our content. Since we are going to send the request in a JSON format, I have mentioned the application/JSON just below the content. Next, just like how we do for response, the same we need to follow. We have to mention the schema. And since we want to explain our request object, we need to mention what is the type of our request. So the type I want to have it as an object. So the request structure, how we can have it here is, it is an object and it can contains list of products and the address details. So it's quite possible, right? Inside an object, we can have another array of objects and another objects. So I want to follow the same structure. So my overall schema data type is an object. And since I'm using object, I have to define the properties as well. Like I need to mention these properties. And the very first property that I want to have here is products. So this is a property name with the name products. And these products, the type is array, because like I said, in an order, we can have any number of products that an end user can order. Like he can order a mobile, he can order a laptop, he can order an headphone. So that's why we want to allow multiple products inside the request body. So due to that reason, for the properties products, I have mentioned the type as an array. And since here we have defined array, after array definitely we have to mention the items, and we need to describe what is the type of each item. Like we have a products array, like what we are going to hold inside this products array. Is it list of strings? Is it list of objects? So we have to define that. So that's why immediately after items, we need to mention the type of each item. So the type of each item is object. So here, since we have mentioned the type as an object, we definitely have to mention that object properties. That's why we need to use these properties. And the very first property that I want to define here is product ID. So this will have the product ID details. So the product ID has to be an integer. That's why I will mention this type as an integer. So let me mention type as an integer here. So the next property that we can have here is name. So the type is again string here. After the name, we have the price, and the type of the price is number since we want to allow the decimal value. And after price, we have category name. So the category name property type is again string. So we have to mention the same here. And at last we have quantity. So the meaning of quantity here is that my end user can buy 2 mobiles of same product or 2 laptops of same product. So this quantity indicates the quantity of the products inside the order. So that's why we need to make sure we have to mention this type as an integer, and we have used the same quantity inside the other APIs also, but in those APIs the quantity represents the overall stock of the product. Like maybe in simple language I can say that whenever my easy shop is returning the data, and inside the data if you have quantity, it represents the overall stock. Whereas if my consumers, whenever they are trying to consume the APIs, and if they are sending a quantity inside the request, that represents the overall quantity of the product inside an order. So now we have successfully defined our array object schema structure. Like under our overall schema object, we have an products array, which again consists of an objects with all this data. So along with the products array, I also want to accept the address details. So that's why we need to come to the same position where products is there. And here I am going to start a new property with the name address. And the type of this address property has to be object. So now since it is an object, I again have to explain the properties of this object. So the properties that I'm going to have here is, so these are the properties that I want to have, like address line 1 is one of the property which is of type string, and post that we can have city, state, zip code. So these are all the properties present inside this address object. So with this, we successfully represented our request body schema structure. But here we are getting an error because after this type and array, I have not given any space. So we have to give space, which is very important. So please make sure all your keys are showing in this color and all your values are showing in the white color. So inside the YAML syntax, after every key, you have to give this space value if you are mentioning the value inside the same line. So you can see if I remove this space, the whole line is becoming invalid. So that's why please make sure you are mentioning that space. So with this, we have successfully created the request body and its schema structure. And when we are done with this, I'm going to show you how this structure is going to look like. Then it will make more sense to you. Now you can see we are getting an error saying that responses are missing. We have provided the request body, but where is the responses? So let's try to provide the same. So for the same, I have closed the request body and post that here we can provide responses to start describing the responses schema structure. So here the status code that I want to use is 201. So whenever we are using HTTP post, as per the standards, we have to return the 201. So 201 indicates the given resource or the given request data is successfully created on the backend. So that's what 201 indicates. So that's why I need to give this 201 here as a code. And after this, I'm going to mention the description using the description here. And once we provide the description, we can describe the content of this response, which belongs to the 201 code. So inside the content, again, I have to mention application/JSON. Since our response is going to be in JSON format, I have to mention this. And after this, we have to mention schema to describe the schema of our response object. So as soon as we mention schema, we have to mention the type. So the type I want to have it here is object. And since we are using object, definitely we have to explain the properties of the object. So that's why I have mentioned this properties field here. Post that I am pressing an enter, and here we can mention the property details. Like the very first property that I want to have here is order ID, and the type is integer. So I want to have only this value inside my response. So the purpose of this order ID is whenever the order creation is successfully processed in the backend of each shop, it is going to return an order ID to my consumers, so that the same order ID they can display to the end users, and my consumers also they can store this order ID for their future reference. So with this, we have successfully created a new API that supports HTTP post. So if you try to expand everything, so this is very simple and easy. Like we have to mention the API path, and after the API path, you just have to mention this post followed by summary, description. And since for post, the request is mandatory, you have to mention this request body. And similarly, we have to mention the responses. So here you can observe the details that we write after content is similar inside request body and responses. So we'll just mention what is the media type of our content, post that schema, and we'll try to explain it. So here we also follow the same, like content, what is the media type of our content, schema, and we're trying to explain the schema structure. So now let's try to understand how this is looking like inside our Swagger UI. So for the same, I'm going to drag this to left hand side. So now you can see there is a new post orders came into picture. If I click on this, you will see there will be no parameters, but request body came into picture, which is of type application/JSON. And you can see this is how our request schema is going to look like. Like it is of type object, and inside that object, we have a products property, which is of type array. So that's why you can see square bracket here. And inside this array, every item is an product object which holds product ID, name, price, category name, quantity. And after this products array, we have another object which is of type address, and it has address line 1, city, state, zip code. So as of now, you can see all the example values it is showing based upon the default values. Like for string, it will show string. For integers and numbers, it will show 0. So the same structure you can also try to understand here under schema. Like we have an object which has products of type array. So you can confirm the same by looking at these square brackets, which confirms it's an array. And we have the last object which is of type address, and it has all these properties. And if you expand these products, it's an array. That's why all these object details are surrounded by these square brackets. So now if you go to the responses, you can see for 201, the media type is application/JSON, which we have defined. And this is how they're going to get a response. They'll just get an order ID, which is of type integer, and you can confirm the same inside the schema. So here you can also click on this try it out option. So you can see the request body is populated automatically based upon the example data. If needed, you can change all these values, and you can click on this execute, but definitely you're going to get an error. But if you see, this is how the curl request is going to look like. And this is the request URL where the request has been sent. And the response, obviously, it is an error response because the server URL is not valid. So I'm clicking on this clear again, and we can click on this cancel to go to the normal Swagger UI. So this way we have successfully described an HTTP POST API with the help of OpenAPI specification. The only new thing that we learn here is request body, how to pass the data in the request body. So that's a newly thing that we have learned. So the same request body we have to follow for put operation or update operation. So whenever you are into situations where you have to explain an request body of an API, please use this request body followed by this structure that we have discussed. So with this, I'm assuming you're super clear. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now in this lecture, let's try to describe an put operation or an put API using OpenAPI specification. So like you know, we can use HTTP put operation or HTTP put method whenever we want to update an existing data. So the scenario that we are trying to address with the help of put API is, maybe think of a scenario like once an order has been placed, my end user want to change the order. Maybe he want to change the address, or maybe he want to remove one of the product from the order, or maybe he want to change the quantity of the products inside the order. So the scenario can be anything. So to accommodate this, my Easy Shop application should have an orders API which accepts the HTTP put method, so that my consumers can invoke this API based upon the actions that my end user is doing in their website. So for the same, inside this lecture, let's try to introduce a new API that supports put operation. So like you can see here, total we have 5 APIs. So let me scroll this Swagger UI to the right hand side. So here we have a post operation API, and I have a question here for you, like, do we really need another API path supporting put operation? So the answer is no. The reason is we can reuse the same API path, but instead of post, what we can do is we can mention the put operation, and we can describe the request structure, response structure, everything together. So for the same, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy the content that I have under orders API. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the same content one more time under orders API. So now here, instead of post, we have to put it as put. Otherwise, my OpenAPI specification will not allow, because using one API path, we can define only once for each HTTP method. So here I'm describing the operation details for the post operation. So very similarly, I have here for put operation. So for push operation, the summary can be update order. The description also we can update something like update order details to Easy Shop for processing and shipping. So now definitely even the put operation also will expect the request. So that's why we need to mention this request body here, and under request body content application JSON schema as type object. So everything is going to be very similar to what we have discussed for post operation. But here we need one more extra column or an extra data inside the put operation. So this is just a question for you. Can you tell me what is that extra field that we need to pass inside the put compared to post? So your time starts now. 1, 2, 3. Yes, you are correct. We need to pass the order ID also, because without order ID, my Easy Shop cannot update the existing order details. So as of now, inside our request body, there is no order ID. We just have product ID details, and there is no order ID. And this order ID, if you can recall, inside our post API, it will come as an response data. So the same order ID my consumers has to pass again whenever they want to update the order details. So now what I have to do here is, so if you look at the request body of my put operation, so my overall schema type is object. Under the properties, I have a products array and I have an address. So just above products array, I also expect one more new property, which is order ID. And this order ID type is integer. So with this, we should be good for the request body structure. Now, if you go to the response, whenever we are dealing with the HTTP put operations, the response ideally we can send is 200. So 200 indicates that the request has been processed successfully. So the description can be order details updated successfully. So now here we don't have to send any content, we can just remove this. The reason is the order ID details already known to my consumer, so we don't have to repeat the same. So that's why I'm just removing this entire content under the response. So now my response will only have 200 and some status description saying that order details updated successfully. So now with this, we have successfully implemented put API also under orders path. So let me close this post API description. So under orders, you can see we have both post and put. So now let's try to see how this is looking like inside the Swagger UI. So for put, you can see it is coming in orange color. So that kind of color difference is there for each HTTP GET methods. Like all GET will have blue, post will have green, and put has some orange color. So now if I click on this put orders link that I have, you should be able to see there are no parameters, but coming to request body, this is how it is going to look like. The very first element or property inside my request body is what is the order ID, and after the order ID we can expect the array of products with the property name products and address details. Like in the scenario, if someone want to change address details, I'll get the latest address details, and I can also consider the latest product details that I'm getting inside this products array to process and shipping them. Like in the post request, I may get 2 product details. Now in the put request, I may get only 1 order details. That means one of the product has been cancelled. So that's how I can interpret inside my backend logic. And you can also confirm the same structure inside the schema. Like the very first property is order ID of type integer, products is an array of type product object, and under address we have all these properties. Now coming to the response, for the 200 response, you can see there won't be any response body or data. It's just that they are going to get a code of 200 and a status description saying that order details updated successfully. So now my consumer know like clearly, okay, whenever I'm making an HTTP put operation for this orders API, I should not expect anything inside the response. I will just look for the response code, which is 200. If I receive 200 as a response code, then that means my order details are updated successfully at the back end of the Easy Shop. So with this, we also described put API with the help of OpenAPI specification. In the next lecture, let's try to describe and delete API operation as well. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now in this lecture, let's try to describe and delete API with the help of OpenAPI specification. As of now, under the orders, we have handled the scenarios of creating and updating, and there might be a good chance where my end user, whoever is using my consumer website, they may want to cancel their order. Like once they have placed an order, they can cancel their order, and that's perfectly a valid scenario. That's why my Easy Shop should have an API which supports the deleting of an order. So my consumers, they can invoke this delete API whenever my end user is trying to cancel their order. So here what we can do is, just like how we describe the post and put operations, we can also describe a new operation which supports HTTP delete. So let me drag this towards the left. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to take this entire content of the put method and I'm going to paste just after put. So let me paste that. So now after pasting the content, I can change the put method to the delete, and accordingly I can remove the summary like delete order, and description also delete order details from Easy Shop. So I don't need to mention this for processing and shipping. And since the description is only 1 line now, what we can do is we can mention this value immediately next to the description field. So for the same, I have removed that pipe symbol, and you can see here for delete operations, request body is not supported, just like how we have for get. Even for delete operations also, request body is not allowed. Instead, we can send the parameters as an query params or path params or header parameters or cookie parameters. So we can do anything around parameters, but request body is not allowed. So let me delete this entire request body. So now I can't use this API exactly because my backend server should know the order ID value in order to delete or cancel an order. So for the same, I'm going to define the parameters. So I'm entering the field value as parameters, and under parameters, I'm going to define a query input param with the name order ID. So I'm just going to start an array here. So the very first field is name, and the name of the parameter is order ID. And the next field that we can mention is in. So the order ID I'm expecting inside my query param, but not the path param. So that's why I have mentioned in as query. And after this, I'm going to mention as required as true. The reason is, without this order ID, I can't delete or I can't cancel an order. So that's why I'm making these required as true. Now everything is good. It's just that we need to describe the schema of our order ID. So for the same, I need to give this schema, and after that I'm going to mention type as an integer. So with this, we have successfully defined an input query parameter with the name order ID. Now coming to the responses, I'm going to have the response code which is 204. So 204 means it indicates there is no content. Obviously, once our order has been cancelled, there should not be any content inside my backend database. So that's why whenever we are using delete operation, we should provide the successful response in the form of 204. And the description, I can mention something like order details cancelled successfully. So this way we have implemented one more API that supports the delete operation. So now let's see how this is looking inside the Swagger UI. So for delete, you can see obviously it has to be red color because we are deleting something. It's a kind of warning. So that's why here you can see everything in the red color. And if you click on this, under parameters, the order ID is the query param, which is of type integer, and it is a mandatory one. That's why it is showing this asterisk symbol. Under responses, I have code as 204. So whenever I get a 204, that indicates to my consumers that an particular order is cancelled successfully by my Easy Shop backend server. So with this, we have implemented most of the HTTP methods like get, post, put, and delete. Now as an assignment, I want you to define one more API under orders that support get. The purpose of this get API of orders is whenever someone is passing the order ID, it has to provide the order details back in the response. So inside the response, you can expect the order ID, the array of products, the address details. So this will be used in the scenarios. Sometimes my end user who is using my consumer website, they can see the history of their orders. So whenever that navigation is happening, my Easy Shop will get an API call to this get orders API path, and that will send the required information which can be eventually displayed on the UI to the end user. So that's a scenario. So I hope you're getting, like, you have to build an get orders API. The input, obviously you have to accept a query parameter which is of type mandatory, and this query parameter should have order ID, and inside the response you should return a schema object which has order ID, array of products, and address details. So I hope you're clear. Like, please try this, and I'm going to show you the solution in the next lecture. Thank you. Bye. I hope you are successful at describing the get orders API with the help of OpenAPI specification. If not, don't worry, we are going to solve it together. So like you can see here, what I'm going to do is just after delete, I'm going to introduce a new method which is get. So after this, we are going to have the summary and description. So let me copy the summary and description from delete, and I'm just going to mention the same after get. So summary, I will update it to get order details. So similarly, I'll update the description as get order details from Easy Shop. Now for get, since the request body is not accepted, we have to define the parameters for this one. So the parameters we can accept in two forms. One is with the help of query params, the other one with the help of path params. So here I'm going to follow the query params only. So for the same, I'm going to copy this entire content of parameters that we have under delete, and I'm going to mention the same inside my get API. So nothing we have to change here. The name also we can use the same, like order ID, and it is of type query parameter, and it has to be required is equal to true. Otherwise there is no way for my Easy Shop backend to fetch the order details. And the schema type is integer for this order ID. So now what we can do is we have to define the response structure for our get API. For the same, first I need to mention the responses tag followed by what is the HTTP code that you want to define here. So here the response that I want to build is for the HTTP code of type 200, and once we have provided this 200 HTTP status code, we can describe the response. Like for the same, I am going to mention the description. Let me drag this UI to the right hand side so that we get more space. So here the description, what I can do is I can mention fetch order details successfully. So I can remove this cancel here, and with this we should be good with the description. So now my description looks good. Now what we can do is we can mention the content and the application/JSON and the schema. So under the schema, we are going to describe the structure of our response object. So that's why I need to mention the type as an object. So inside this object, I'm going to return the order ID, array of products, and the address details. So if you can recall, we have followed the same structure for the put request body. So that's why I'm going to open the put API that we have here, and I'm going to copy all these properties that I have under the request body object. So let me copy all these values, and here I'm going to copy paste just below the object type of my delete API. So all these properties, I have to move them inside of my properties. I have done that. That's why the errors are resolved now. So here you can see under the properties, the very first one is order ID, and the next one is properties of type array. And since we are using array, we are going to explain the items, and each item type is an object. And since we are using object again here, we have to explain these properties. And the properties are product ID, name, price, category name, quantity, and the address again is an object. Under this, we have the properties like address line, city, state, zip code. So this way we have successfully described the get API as well. And here you might have a very good or a valid question. There is a lot of repetition of these object explanation, like the same structure I have used in the put, the same structure I'm using in the get. So you might be interested to know if there is anything like where I can put all my common schema definitions into a single place and I can reuse the same again and again in multiple places. Yes, that's perfectly possible. And this is an advanced topic. We are going to discuss this in the coming lectures. So now let me show you this, how it is looking inside my Swagger UI. So just after delete, we have a get orders, and you can see the order ID is an input query parameter, which is a mandatory. And for the response code 200, the media type we are going to respond is application JSON, and the example value, this is how it is going to look like order ID, array of products, and address details. The same you can identify under the schema details. So this way we have successfully described all our APIs like get, post, delete, put, and you might be under the assumption you now become a master of the OpenAPI specification. So here I want to highlight this is only the basics of OpenAPI specification. With this knowledge, you can easily understand any OpenAPI specification document, and you can write OpenAPI specification document for any kind of APIs. But this is all a basic way of doing things, but there are many advanced topics which we are going to discuss throughout this course in the coming lectures. So hold your breath, hold your interest, and we are going to master OpenAPI specification together. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. I hope you are successful at describing the get orders API with the help of OpenAPI specification. If not, don't worry, we are going to solve it together. So like you can see here, what I'm going to do is just after delete, I'm going to introduce a new method which is get. So after this, we are going to have the summary and description. So let me copy the summary and description from delete, and I'm just going to mention the same after get. So summary, I will update it to get order details. So similarly, I'll update the description as get order details from Easy Shop. Now for get, since the request body is not accepted, we have to define the parameters for this one. So the parameters we can accept in two forms. One is with the help of query params, the other one with the help of path params. So here I'm going to follow the query params only. So for the same, I'm going to copy this entire content of parameters that we have under delete, and I'm going to mention the same inside my get API. So nothing we have to change here. The name also we can use the same like order ID, and it is of type query parameter, and it has to be required is equal to true. Otherwise there is no way for my Easy Shop backend to fetch the order details. And the schema type is integer for this order ID. So now what we can do is we have to define the response structure for our get API. For the same, first I need to mention the responses tag followed by what is the HTTP code that you want to define here. So here the response that I want to build is for the HTTP code of type 200, and once we have provided this 200 HTTP status code, we can describe the response. Like for the same, I am going to mention the description. Let me drag this UI to the right hand side so that we get more space. So here the description, what I can do is I can mention fetch order details successfully. So I can remove this cancel here, and with this we should be good with the description. So now my description looks good. Now what we can do is we can mention the content and the application/JSON and the schema. So under the schema, we are going to describe the structure of our response object. So that's why I need to mention the type as an object. So inside this object, I'm going to return the order ID, array of products, and the address details. So if you can recall, we have followed the same structure for the put request body. So that's why I'm going to open the put API that we have here, and I'm going to copy all these properties that I have under the request body object. So let me copy all these values, and here I'm going to copy paste just below the object type of my delete API. So all these properties, I have to move them inside of my properties. I have done that. That's why the errors are resolved now. So here you can see under the properties, the very first one is order ID, and the next one is properties of type array. And since we are using array, we are going to explain the items, and each item type is an object. And since we are using object again here, we have to explain these properties, and the properties are product ID, name, price, category name, quantity, and the address again is an object. Under this we have the properties like address line, city, state, zip code. So this way we have successfully described the get API as well. And here you might have a very good or a valid question. There is a lot of repetition of these object explanation, like the same structure I have used in the put, the same structure I'm using in the get. So you might be interested to know if there is anything like where I can put all my common schema definitions into a single place and I can reuse the same again and again in multiple places. Yes, that's perfectly possible. And this is an advanced topic. We are going to discuss this in the coming lectures. So now let me show you this, how it is looking inside my Swagger UI. So just after delete, we have a get orders, and you can see the order ID is an input query parameter, which is a mandatory. And for the response code 200, the media type we are going to respond is application JSON, and the example value, this is how it is going to look like order ID, array of products, and address details. The same you can identify under the schema details. So this way we have successfully described all our APIs like get, post, delete, put, and you might be under the assumption you now become a master of the OpenAPI specification. So here I want to highlight this is only the basics of OpenAPI specification. With this knowledge, you can easily understand any OpenAPI specification document, and you can write OpenAPI specification document for any kind of APIs. But this is all a basic way of doing things, but there are many advanced topics which we are going to discuss throughout this course in the coming lectures. So hold your breath, hold your interest, and we are going to master OpenAPI specification together. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now in this lecture, let's try to quickly recap all the concepts that we have discussed under the paths object. So throughout this section, we have talked a lot about paths, how to define various API paths, supporting various HTTP methods, how to define the input parameters, request body, response structure. So all these concepts we discussed extensively, and we also practiced with enough API paths defined inside our OpenAPI specification. But let's quickly recap all those concepts very quickly in this lecture. So like you can see here, we have started our discussion by looking at this paths object hierarchy. So the paths is a root element just like OpenAPI and info, and this is a mandatory root element. If you don't have any API paths defined inside your OpenAPI specific, you can define it as an empty. Whereas if you have certain API paths to define or describe with the help of OpenAPI specification, we can define any number of paths by starting with the what is your endpoint path. So whenever you want to define an endpoint, you have to start with the / and what is the relative path of your API. And once we define this API path, the path item object will start from there. And like you can see under the endpoint URL, you can define what is the HTTP method that it is going to support. Like is it an get, put, post or delete. So the HTTP method details you can provide. And like we discussed, under a single API path, you can define multiple HTTP methods like get, put, post, as long as the API path is same for them. And once you define the HTTP method details, you can mention the operation object details, like what is the summary of your operation, what is the description. And if you have a request to body, like in the scenarios of post and put, you can mention that. And if you have input parameters, like in the scenarios of get and delete, you can mention that with the help of parameters. And at last, we can also describe our response structure for various HTTP response codes like 200, 201, 500, error codes. So you can define the response object any number of times for different HTTP status codes. Under response object, we can mention the description, content, and using the schema, we can describe the type of our response object. So this is the whole summary or the simple story behind the paths object. But if you look into in details, using operation object, we can define the summary and description of an API operation. So basically an API operation object will have what is the summary, description, parameters, response payload, request payload structure, what are the possible servers response. So all these details together we can club inside an operation object. Though we have never used something like operation inside our OpenAPI specification, like whatever you're trying to describe under a path with the HTTP method, the whole description together, we can call it as an operation object. So this is the sample structure of the operation object that you can see on the left hand side of the slide. And coming to the responses object, using the responses object, we can define response structure for various HTTP status codes. So you can see here on the right hand side, the screenshot that it has, this APIs has two response structures, one for the 200 status code and the other one for the 404 status code. So this way we can define the response schema structure for various server codes or various HTTP status codes. And under responses, definitely whenever we are trying to define the response schema structure for a specific HTTP status code, we are going to use the response object to define the schema of our response. So how we are going to do that? By mentioning the description, by mentioning the content. Under the content, we can mention what is the content type, like what is the media type, is it an application JSON or it is an application XML. So all those details we can mention under the content. And once we define these content details, and like you can see here, after content, both in the response object and request body object, you are going to mention what is the content type, and these content type values, we call them as media map, because this media map will have the details like application/JSON, application/XML. And once you define that media type object, under the media type object, you can define the schema. And once you define the schema, you have to describe your schema object. So during the schema object explanation, you have to use the type keyword. Using type, you can define arrays or object. And whenever you are using arrays, you have to describe the items inside your arrays with the help of items. Whereas if it is a simple object, you can use the properties. And if needed, you can also provide the examples as well for your schema object values with the help of example. We're going to discuss about example in the coming lectures. And like you can see, the schema object can have multiple inner objects, inner arrays. Like you can build any schema structure, any complex schema structure with the help of schema object. And if you have multiple media types supporting inside your APIs, you can also mention multiple media type objects and you can repeat the schema object again and again. So like you can see here, this is the content object, how it is going to look like if you want to describe multiple media contents or multiple media types inside a response or a request body. Like under content, I can mention application/JSON, and inside that I can have schema details described. And very similar way, if I want to have the media type as an HTML, I can mention like something like text/HTML. Whereas if I want to allow all kind of text, I can also use the wildcards like text/asterisk. So this way I can define multiple content types, but I rarely see people supporting multiple content types with a single API. Most of the APIs, they support JSON, and you can rarely see a single API supporting both JSON and XML and HTML kind of combination. You won't see usually on day-to-day projects. So under content, you will mention what is the media type. Under media type, you are going to mention the schema. So how schema is going to look like is, like you can see, schema object is up to us how simple we want to keep it or how complex we want to keep it. So based upon our request structure and response structure, we are going to define it inside our OpenAPI specification. And like we discussed previously, the same standards, the same specifications can be used both in the request body and the response schema objects. So the very first example you can see, it is a simple schema where we have a single field of type integer, and the minimum value is 1 and the maximum value is 100. So here I don't even have a name for my property because it's not an object. It's just a simple number that I want to return without any property name or key name. If I'm using this schema content inside my response, my consumers will simply get an integer as a response. And the second example you can see, I can define a string as an response or a request body with the help of type string. And if needed, I can also define what are the valid values that are supported by this schema type string with the help of enum. So using enum, you can mention multiple valid values. Like in the scenario of gender, the valid values are male and female. So very similar way, you can define any number of valid values for any field by using the enum keyword like we are seeing on the second example. Now coming to the third example where I'm trying to define an array here. So whenever I want to have array of elements or array of objects, I can mention type as an array. And whenever I'm using type as an array, I can also define minimum items and maximum items that my array can support. So using min items, I'm mentioning the value as 1, which means always there should be at least one object or element inside my array. And the maximum also I can define with the help of max items. And one important thing that you have to make sure here is whenever you are using type as an array, you should also use items, and using items, you have to explain the data type of your elements inside your array. So here my array is going to have list of integer elements. That's why after items I have mentioned type as integer. Finally, if you look at the fourth example, which is a kind of complex example. So here I'm just making my schema as an object. When we say schema as an object, definitely the next question my OpenAPI specification or any consumer will have is, what are the properties that you support inside your object? So that's where we need to define these property details with the help of properties. So once we define these properties, like along with their data types, the whole object will make sense to anyone who is reading this schema definition. So this way we can define any complex schema definition. It can have multiple inner objects, multiple inner arrays. So that's all possible with the help of schema object. And next you can see here, like we also discussed how to pass the input parameters by using the parameters keyword. Like whenever we want to pass the input parameters, we can define the parameters inside the OpenAPI specification, and the fields that my parameters object is going to expect is what is the name of the parameter and where are you expecting this parameter. So with the help of in, we can define values like query, path, cookie and header, and we can mention whether the it is a mandatory param or a optional param. And apart from defining the simple input parameters, you can also define a complex input objects by using again the same content and schema media maps. Like you can send an entire JSON as an input as part of query param or path param. So that kind of complex definition also is possible. And now coming to the request body object, in the scenarios of post and put operations, definitely the request body is an mandatory element. So inside request body, we can define the description, we can define the content, and under the content, we can use a media map, like whether it is an JSON or XML. And once we define the media type, we can define the schema with the help of schema and by following the schema object structure. And finally, here you can see the parameter object, like these are the in details about the parameters object. Like whenever you're trying to send the input through the parameters, definitely you have to define that with the help of parameters object. And these are the fields allowed inside the parameters, like name and in are the mandatory fields. And you can also see we have description and required and parameter type as optional fields here. And on the left hand side, you can also see one of the example where we are trying to send the data with the help of query param. So very similarly, like how we are sending the data inside input parameters, we can also send the data with the help of request body object. And this is how it is going to look like whenever we are trying to use the request body. Like under request body, we have to define what is the content, and under the content we have to mention what is the media type. And once we mention the media type, which is like application/JSON, you have to mention the schema, and post that it's up to you how complex you want to define your request body object. So this is the whole story that we have discussed as of now, and this is the quick recap. So you can also have all these slides with you, like you can download all these slides, and you can always refer these slides in future whenever you want to quickly recap all the OpenAPI topics that we have discussed inside this course. I also updated all the files that we have discussed inside the GitHub repository. Like you can see, if you go to this GitHub location, like github.com/easybyte/OpenAPI, you will be taken to this OpenAPI GitHub repository. If you scroll down here, I have all the important links mentioned for your reference. And at the same time, if you open this folder, which is like OpenAPI YAML examples, you will be able to see all the examples that we have discussed so far. The very first document indicates some minimal document of OpenAPI specification. The second one indicates the concepts that we have discussed about info, contact, license, and servers object. And the third file has the first API that we have described with the help of OpenAPI specification. Like if you can scroll down, this is the first API that we have written. So very similarly, if you go to the fourth YAML file that we have all the APIs that we have discussed so far, like categories, orders, products, everything we have here. So I'm going to keep updating all the YAML files that we are going to discuss in the coming lectures also. So this is the place where you can always refer for the YAML content that we have discussed inside the course. And by the way, one more note here is the extension of YAML file should be .yml or YAML. So any of these extension is valid. So that's why you can see the extension here. So with this, I'm assuming you are super clear about all the concepts that we have discussed so far. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now in this lecture, I'm going to show you a good useful website in terms of OpenAPI specification. The website is openapi-map.apihandyman.io. So the same website details I have mentioned inside our GitHub repository also. Like you can see, this is a OpenAPI map with the URL details. So if you click on that, you will be redirected to this web page. So how this website is going to help you is, whenever you have some question about the structure of the OpenAPI specification, what are the mandatory elements, what are the structure that I have to follow whenever I want to define some request body or response or parameters or paths. So your question can be anything. You can always come to this website. You can quickly check the OpenAPI specification structure visually. So I'm going to show you that in few seconds. And this website has options of both 2.0 and 3.0 version. So since 3.0 is the latest version and the same we are discussing inside this lecture, let's try to explore the 3.0 version. So if you see here on the home page, you have a small dot here. Like if I zoom further, you can see this dot with the name OpenAPI 3.0. So if you click on this dot, you will get an map saying that so these are the root elements of OpenAPI 3.0. So the very first root element that we have to define is OpenAPI, followed by info, servers, paths, components, security, tags, external docs. So these are all the root elements, and of course we are yet to discuss about component, security, tags and external docs. So don't worry, we're going to discuss them. But the beauty, if you see here, all the mandatory elements are highlighted in red color. And if one of the element has further details inside it, you can see the circle filled with color. Like this is an empty circle without any color. That means this is just a simple element. Whereas if you click on the info circle, you can see it is further showing the information related to the info object, where title is the mandatory, description, terms of service, these are optional, and same for version is mandatory. And inside each layer you will be seeing this X hyphen. So using X hyphen, we can define our own custom tags at each level. So we're going to discuss that in the coming lectures. So that's the purpose of X hyphen. For now, please ignore that. And further, if you drill down inside contact, you can see here contact has name, URL, email, and same for license. You have a name which is mandatory followed by URL. So if you click on that again, it is going to close that object details. So let me close this info. Similarly for servers also, since it has a circle with a filled color, this indicates it has more information inside that. So for servers, URL is the mandatory element, followed by description and variables. And now coming to the interesting element, which is paths. If you click on that, it is showing here every path has to start with a / followed by what is the path value. So if you click on this circle again, you can see you will get a very big map description starting with summary, description, and for each HTTP method you can see there is an object. So let me click on this post. So if you click on this HTTP post, you can see we can mention the tags information. We are ready to discuss about the tags, so don't worry, we are going to discuss that. We can mention the summary, description, operation ID, parameters, request body, response. So if you click on this, any of this request body and response, you should be able to see what is the structure that we need to follow. First, we need to mention the optional description and followed by content, whether it is required or not. So under content, you can see you have to mention what is a media type. And once you define the media type, you can use the schema. Using schema, you can define your objects. And after schema, we can also define the examples or example using these keywords. We're going to discuss about examples in the coming lectures. So this way you can explore the entire OpenAPI specification structure at any point of time. So I would always recommend you looking at this whenever you have some question, and based upon this structure you can always understand which is mandatory, what are the structure that you need to follow. And apart from this map object, you can also see what are the deleted properties inside 3.0 compared to the previous version. So like we were discussing previously, the root element that we used to have in 2.0 is Swagger. Since later on it is acquired by SmartBeer and they donated this specification to the open source community, they renamed this root element to OpenAPI. So that's what you can see, what is the deleted property, what is it is replaced by. So all those details you can see, and you can also click on this documentation to read the official documentation around it. And very similarly, you can also identify what are the new properties that are introduced as part of 3.0. So this way you can always use this website to refer to the OpenAPI specification structure. I hope you found this as an interesting and useful website. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now in this section, let's try to focus on improving the documentation of our APIs by leveraging various options that we have inside the OpenAPI specification. As of now, we are just describing our APIs or any other fields with the help of description. Like you can see, I'm trying to describe our API's purpose by using this description field that we have inside the info. And under this description, we have just written some simple text explaining the purpose of this OpenAPI specification. But if given a chance and I have provided with a Word document like Microsoft Word document or PowerPoint, I can describe it with even more good styles like with the help of bold letters, italic letters. So using these documents like MS Word, PowerPoint or PDF, we can describe our APIs even more better. But don't get carried away with this thought, because even OpenAPI specification allow you to describe your description with the help of bold, italic, highlighting, underlining. So all those things you can do inside the OpenAPI specification as well. For the same, let's try to discuss what is the option that we have. Like you can see here, we are going to use the common mark syntax that is supported by OpenAPI specification. So using common mark syntax, we can describe our fields and OpenAPI specifications with far more better rich text formats. Like you can use headings, you can mention the list, you can mention the bold letters, italic letters, you can mention some sample code structure. So all those things are possible with the help of common mark syntax, and these common mark syntaxes we can use inside the description fields. Like most of the fields that we have inside the OpenAPI, at each and every layer of OpenAPI specification, we have a description field. So using this description field, we can describe our fields, APIs, whole OpenAPI specification with the help of common mark syntax. So like you can see here, whenever you want to mention some headings inside your description, you can use a hash symbol. So if you mention only single hash, that will give a bigger heading compared to 2 hashes and 3 hashes. And very similarly, if you want to highlight some text in italic style, then you can surround the text with the single asterisk mark. And very similarly, if you try to surround your text with the double asterisk marks, the whole text will become bold. And if you want to mix both bold and italic, you can surround your text with the 3 asterisk marks. And you can also highlight some important points using list structure, and you just have to use the hyphen whenever you want to write some list of points. And using links, you can also bring some text or images into your OpenAPI specification, and you can also write code inside your description. Maybe if you want to give some samples inside your description, you can also do that by following the syntax that we have here. So whenever you want to write some code span or code block, we have to use this special character which is grave accent. So grave accent is a special character which you can find in the same key where you have the tilde. So this key is present just below the escape key inside your keyboard. So that key has both tilde and grave accent. So using this grave accent, you can write a code span. If you surround your text with a single grave accent, that entire text will become code span. Whereas if you are trying to represent a block of code, then you have to surround that whole code with 3 grave accent marks like you can see on the slide. And this common mark syntax is not something which is specific to only OpenAPI specification. So this is a standard syntax that is being used extensively inside the industry. Sometimes whenever we want to describe certain concept, instead of writing everything in a simple text, we can use this common mark syntax. And of course, we also have HTML, CSS, but that needs some learning curve to represent everything inside HTML and CSS. So that's why you can always think like this common mark syntax is something which is like above your regular text, but below the HTML. And this can be learned very quickly. And in fact, this common mark syntax is being used extensively inside the GitHub pages. Like you can see here, I have a GitHub repository which I have built as part of microservices course. If you scroll down, usually any GitHub repository, they'll maintain readme.md document, and the same content will be displayed like this beautifully so that the developers can read the details very easily with less efforts. Like you can see, I have some headings, I have some image links, and I also have some bullet points, and similarly I can mention table structure. So all this is possible because of common mark syntax. So if I try to click on this edit button that I have, you can see the raw content of this readme.md. So you can see here the very first heading that we have is coming from the hash mark, and similarly I'm trying to import the image using these links that we have inside the common mark syntax, and we can also mention the bullet points and table structure. Everything we can achieve with this common mark syntax. So the same thing we are going to implement inside our OpenAPI specification as well. So I hope you are clear like what we are going to do inside this section. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now, like you can see here, we have a description which we have mentioned inside the info object. So this is the description that is applicable to our entire OpenAPI specification. So this is the text that someone will read at the very first point whenever someone is trying to check our OpenAPI specification inside a Swagger UI tool. So you can see here, this is the title of my OpenAPI specification, which is showing in a very big bold letter. So this is taken care by the Swagger UI tool. Now coming to the description that we have written, like you can see, everything is shown in a boring text format, and this might not be an good encouragement for our readers to explore further. So what we can do is, with the help of common mark syntax, we can make this something fancy so that people feel that there is some good documentation available, and using this good documentation they can try to understand what is the purpose of this OpenAPI specification, what are the APIs that we have inside this, and how they are going to help them. So all these scenarios we can cover with a good, better documentation. So for the same, what I can do is I can just remove the description that we have. In the same place, first I'm going to introduce a new heading saying that about us. So you can see here the about us is showing as an heading. So if I try to give 2 hashes, so it will become a smaller heading, and the same for 3 hashes, it will become a subheading. So if you have hierarchy of headings, subheadings, you can follow this syntax like single hash, 2 hash, and 3 hash. For now, we can go with a single hash, which will make our about us heading a big and bolder one. So here just below about us, I'm going to paste a content which we can discuss. So don't worry. So here you can see the very first one, which is Easy Shop. I'm trying to mention it as a bold and italic. That's why I have used the 3 asterisk marks. Whereas if I use only 2 asterisks, then I'll get only bold but not italic. And if I use only single asterisk, that means my Easy Shop text will become italic. So let's try to use the 2 asterisk marks, which will make my Easy Shop text as a bold. So here you can see I have written a text saying that Easy Shop is a open market product selling company. Any website can list our products by using our APIs. So another syntax that we have is, if you surround your text with underscore on both sides, so that text will become italic style. So like you can see here, the text APIs right now, it is in the italic style. So I have highlighted that. So with this italic style, we are trying to emphasize the API's word. And after that, you can see I have continued that description saying that shipping and other logistics will be taken care by us. You will get an affiliate commission for selling our products. So here I want to highlight affiliate commission. So what I have done is I have surrounded the affiliate commission text with a grave accent. So like we discussed before, so whenever we try to use a grave accent around a text, it will become like a code span. So like you can see here, it is highlighted like a code. That's why there is a gray background around it, and it is also highlighted in a different color. So this entire word is getting highlighted inside the description along with the Easy Shop and the APIs. So this kind of gives some good feel to the readers who is reading, where we are trying to highlight the key and important points. So next, just after this about us, I also want to explain the categories supported by the Easy Shop. So for the same, I'm going to create a new heading saying that categories supported. So now under this category supported, I want to mention various categories that this Easy Shop is going to support as a list. So what I can do is I can start with hyphen saying that mobiles. So this will show the mobiles word as a list item. So very similarly, I can mention the laptops, and after that I can mention televisions and followed by headphones. So this way we can mention any number of list items with the help of hyphen here. And if you want, you can mention the inner list as well, like inside mobiles. If I want to start one more list, I can do that. I can mention hyphen and I can mention the brands that I support like Apple, Samsung and OnePlus. So this way we can mention list also and tables also by following the common mark syntax inside our OpenAPI specification. And please note that this kind of values we can only define inside the description, because description is meant to describe our APIs with a lengthy text. So that's why please use them inside the description fields wherever you see inside your OpenAPI specification based upon the need that you have. And if needed, you can also give some code samples. So in order to give some code samples, like I said, you have to start with the 3 grave accents. So for the same, you just have to press the key just below the escape 3 times, and this will give 3 grave accent. I'm going to do the same one more time. Now inside this, I can provide some code saying that like method 1, and I can write some sample code, and this is how it is going to look like. So like you can see, this is looking far better. Whatever code that you write in between these grave accent symbols, it is going to be highlighted in a far better manner compared to a normal text. So, but for now, I don't think we need to mention some code samples here. So I'm going to revert this. And with that, you can see our description now is looking far better. And this way we can describe any of the fields that we have inside the OpenAPI specification. And I just wanted to show you, we also have this option. If you want to explore what are all the options that we have inside the common mark syntax, I would suggest you to explore any blogs or any tutorials around common mark syntax. But whatever we have discussed now, this should be good enough to start. But if you have some complex requirements like displaying images, table structure, writing a lot of code inside your description, obviously you can explore that. But this is going to be a good starting point for you. So with this, I'm assuming you're super clear about how to use the common mark syntax inside our OpenAPI specification. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. In the previous lecture, we have described our OpenAPI specification description beautifully with the help of common mark syntax. And you might be under the impression that I can do this common mark syntax only for the description that I have under the info object. But that is not the correct understanding. You can use this common mark syntax for the description fields, like wherever you are trying to define them. The same description you can see we have at many places, like under path we have a summary and description. So here we have a description, and for parameters we can use description, for response we can use description. So there are many places inside OpenAPI specification where we can use this description, and wherever we are allowed to use this description field, in all those places you can use the open mark syntax. So now inside this lecture, what we can do is we can try to use the common mark syntax for one of the property that we have, which is quantity. So quantity right now it has some ambiguity. We are treating the quantity representing as a stock value when our Easy Shop is trying to send that information to the consumers, whereas when our consumers are trying to place an order, this quantity represents the number of items. So there is some clear ambiguity. Without we explaining this inside the description, it is very hard for someone to understand this. That's why what we can do is we can go to the place where we have this quantity field. So like you can see here under this products, I have this quantity field. So what I can do here is just after type, I can start the description field. And here, since we want to mention a very lengthy description, I'm going to give this pipe symbol, which is from YAML, and this indicates that I'm going to have a multiple lines of description. So here I'm going to copy some content. So let me copy the content here. So like you can see here, I have copied this content, and here I just written some description saying that quantity represents the stock value when this field is being sent by EasyShop. Whereas in the scenarios of consumers sending this field, it represents the number of product items inside the order. Consumers are expected to handle the scenario of stopping the end user when the stock value is 0. So this is a good description that I can feel, but of course you can further improvise it based upon your needs in your real-time projects. So here you can see I have used the common mark syntax at many places. So let me show you that inside the UI so that we can discuss. So this one is coming under products, and if you go to the response and schema, and if you expand the schema under the quantity, you can see right now we have this beautiful description saying that quantity represents so and so, and these are the so and so rules. All this value you can see it is displaying based upon the common mark syntax. So the quantity word I have mentioned 3 asterisks, that's why it is showing bold and italic, and the stock I have highlighted that text with the help of grave accent key. And very similarly I have done the same for number of product items, and at last you can see I have highlighted when the stock value is 0 with the italic and underline. So for italic we have to use single asterisk mark, whereas for underline you can see I have used the HTML tag which is U. So if you use this opening U tag and closing U tag, that is going to make your text underlines. So there are unlimited possibilities with open mark syntax how you want to use, but the only thing that I want to highlight here is we can use this common mark syntax throughout your OpenAPI specification wherever you are trying to use your description field. So I'm going to copy paste the same under other places where I have the quantity. So let me scroll down. So here I have a quantity field. So let me copy paste this, and I'm going to do the same for orders also. Inside orders under the post we have a quantity. So I'm going to do the same, and this I have done for post. So let me do that same for put also. So here also have quantity field. So this way I'm providing a better documentation to my consumers who are trying to understand my APIs with the help of Swagger UI. So with this I'm assuming you are super clear about what is common mark syntax, what is the purpose of it, how we can use that inside the OpenAPI specification. Thank you, and catch you in the next lecture. Bye. Now, inside this lecture, let's try to explore the other option that we have to improve the documentation of our APIs whenever we are using OpenAPI specification. So the option that we are going to discuss here is examples object. So sometimes though we have mentioned all the schema details inside our OpenAPI specification, it makes more clear to the consumers whenever we provide some examples. Like if I just mention my field is of type object and it can support so and so properties, it's okay to some consumers, but if we can provide some examples how this examples data is going to look like for that particular request body or parameter or response, so that will make more happy to our consumers, because through this examples object they can feel that how the real data is going to look like. Instead of they going with their some assumptions, they can look at these examples and they can use this examples data also to think of some business logic on their side. So previously we have used the example inside our OpenAPI specification to provide some example for a field, but example has its own limitations, like you just have to repeat the example keyword for each and every field or element that you have inside your schema, and with the help of example you can only provide one example value. So that's why we can leverage the examples object, using which we can define multiple examples for our schema or for our objects, and the same examples it is going to look like great inside our Swagger UI as well. So I know you may have some questions and you have some confusion here. So let's jump into our OpenAPI specification and implement these examples so that you are clear about what I'm talking here. So this is our OpenAPI specification as of now. So let me close this info object, servers object. Now coming to the categories path, you can see here for this parameter which is category ID, I have mentioned the example, and using this example I have defined an example value, and you can also see this is how it is going to look like inside my Swagger UI, and when I use try it out option also, by default it will show the 101 value. And this is what I can achieve with a single example, but sometimes providing more and more examples will make very clear to my consumers. So that's why what I can do is, instead of this example, I can use examples. So this is a plural form, so please make a note of it. So whenever we are defining examples, we just have to make sure this examples is present in the same position where the schema is present. Under examples, we can provide multiple examples. So in order to mention multiple examples, what I have to do is, first I have to give what is the example name. First example name that I want to have is mobiles. Under this, I can give a value, and the value that I want to store for mobiles example is 101. And very similarly, I can define other examples like laptops 102 and headphones 103 and televisions 104. So mobiles, laptops, headphones, televisions, this is just a name, and you can have any name, and this name does not have any significance inside your API. The value will have the significance, and the purpose of this examples name is, like whenever we are trying to visualize these examples inside Swagger UI, like if you click on this categories option that you have, and if you go to the category ID, you can see under examples now I have a drop down. Like these are all the examples that I can play with. Like for mobiles, the value will be 101. For laptops, the value will be 102. So that's how the example data can keep changing based upon the selection that I'm making. And even under the try it out option also, based upon my selection, the value will keep changing. So this way my consumers have a lot of data for them to try it out. And if needed, I can mention a summary field also for that example mobiles. And inside the summary, I can explain something like use this example for mobiles. So this way now it will show the summary value, and for my consumers it makes more sense now, and they will have various examples covering various scenarios. So just like how we mentioned for parameters, we can mention the same for any place where you are using schema, like in the request body or inside the response. So wherever we are using the schema, in all those places we can define these examples. But please make a note that whatever example values that you are mentioning here, it has to match with the schema. So here my schema is of type integer, so that's why my value has to be some 101. So please make a note of it, and please avoid giving some values which are against your schema, because that will confuse your consumers. So that's why please be careful about this. So now we can give examples at some other place. Like you can see under these responses, we have a schema which is of type array, and this schema is going to return the list of objects of type category, and inside this category we have category ID and name. So what we can do here is we can just mention the examples just in the same position where we have schema. So let me mention this examples, and under these examples I can provide multiple examples data. Like you can see, this API supports two types of response. One is if someone is not passing the category ID, it is going to return all the categories that are supported by EasyShop. Whereas in the scenarios, if my consumer is sending category ID inside my query parameters, then they are going to get a single category details inside the response array. So we can provide such multiple scenarios examples with the help of examples object. So let me mention these examples here. So here I'm going to paste some content here, so don't worry, we're going to discuss here. So like you can see here, I have mentioned two examples data. The very first example data has a name, all categories data, which covers the scenario of all categories. And the second example data that I have is single category data, which covers the scenario where someone is providing category ID inside my query parameters. So like you can see here, we can mention the summary, and under the value in the first example data, since no one is going to send the category ID, I'm going to return all the categories supported by my EasyShop, like mobiles, laptop, headphones, and televisions. And the schema is going to follow the same structure, like category ID is the property and the name is the another property. We just have to follow the same. And very similarly for single category data, I'll just have one object inside my array which holds the category ID and name. So now if you try to go and look the response of this API, you will see you have different options. Like for categories example data, so this is how the data is going to look like. So by looking at this, my consumers, they'll get a sense of my real data, and at the same time They can also change the other option that they have where they can expect a single category example data, and here they'll get only one object inside this array. So this way they can always better understand our APIs. So similarly, let's try to mention these examples for one more API here. So this time I want to provide some examples data for the products API. So under products API, if we can go to the responses here. So inside this response, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mention the examples just in the same position where we have schema. So let me mention the examples here. Under this examples object, I'm going to mention an example data. So here you can see the example data name is products-data, and this is the summary of it. Under the value, I'm going to return list of products. Like this is how my object is going to look like product ID, name, price, category name, quantity. And by looking at this test data, my consumers, they can get some sense like what kind of values that they can expect and how this data is going to look like. The same they can go to the Swagger UI like under get products. So here if you go to the responses, they have only one example data. That's why under drop down we have only one option, and this is how it is going to look like. And this is perfectly following the schema structure that we have, like where we'll have list of products following this object structure. So this way we can mention the examples data wherever you're trying to define your schema. It can be inside the response, it can be inside the request body, or it can be inside your parameters. So this is another good option that we have inside OpenAPI specification, which makes our API's documentation even more better. So I hope you are clear about examples. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye. Now in this lecture, let's try to improve our OpenAPI specification by leveraging one more option called tags. As of now, you can see here, all our APIs, they are present under a section called defaults, and I can close and open this section which will open my list of APIs that are defined inside OpenAPI specification. So there is nothing wrong here, but we can do a better job here. Like think of a scenario, you have some 100 APIs, and in that scenario, if someone is looking for product API or orders API, it is very tough for them to scroll up and down and to search for that with a single default section. Instead, what we can do is we can organize all our APIs into separate sections, or we can group them into separate groups by using the tags option that we have inside the OpenAPI specification. So let's explore that, how to do the same. So like you can see here, with the help of tags inside OpenAPI specification, I can organize my operations or APIs. So what I have to do is, first I have to define the tags element at the root position of my OpenAPI specification, and inside these tags I can define multiple tags values since I want to have multiple sections like orders, categories, products. So first we need to define the metadata about these tags, like what is the name of the tag that you want to display and what is the description of it. So those details you have to define inside your OpenAPI specification with the root element called tags. And once we define these tags information, we just have to reuse the same inside our path objects, like wherever you have defined your operation with the help of OpenAPI specification, in the same place just below the position where you have mentioned the HTTP method details, you can mention the tags that this particular API belongs to. So based upon that information, my Swagger UI can do an intelligent job here, like organizing or grouping your APIs under multiple sections. So let's do this inside our OpenAPI specification so that you are more clear about what I'm trying to convey here. So for the same, let me go to the browser. So this is my OpenAPI specification document. So what I can do is I can close the root element info and servers, and just above paths, I can introduce one more root element with the name tags. And inside this tag, since I can mention multiple tags, what I can do is I can mention the hyphen which indicates an array element inside my YAML. The very first field that I need to provide here is what is the name of my tag. So the very first tag that I want to create is categories, and after name we can also provide the description. Under description I can mention something like categories related operations. So similarly, I can define other categories like for products and orders. So this way I have created total 3 categories. And now my job is to use these categories inside my path declarations that I have done. So now you can see here under categories, just below the HTTP method where I have mentioned get, I need to mention the tags. So the same keyword, like using tags, again, I can mention multiple tags here. Like an API can belongs to multiple tags also, but if your API belongs to only single tag, you can just mention the tag name, which is categories. So the tag name has to match with what you had defined in the top. So let's try to do the same for other path that we have. So I'm doing the same here. And now moving on to the third API that we have here, we can mention the same, but the tag name should be products because this products API belongs to the products tag or product section. So let me do the same for other APIs related to products. So now under orders, I want to mention the tags value as orders. So now I can do the same thing for other APIs that we have. So let me do the same for delete also. And after delete, I'm going to do the same for get as well. So this way I have mentioned the tags for all the APIs. Now if you see on the right hand side, my Swagger UI already detected this tags information, and now it is showing all the APIs based upon the sections. So now what I can do is I can simply close all the tags, and whenever I want to understand the orders paths or products paths or categories paths, I can click on the particular section and accordingly I can browse. So this way I can organize or group my APIs inside my OpenAPI specification. And like I was telling, a single API can be present in multiple categories also. Like think of a scenario, these categories we want to list under orders as well. So then we just have to give one more array element, and now if you go and check under orders, you will have categories here, and inside the category section also you will have categories path. So this way we can also mention a single API path inside multiple tags as well, but for now this is not making sense to our use case, so let me remove this. But I just wanted to show you an example, that's why I have showed this approach to you. But it's up to you if you want to define your APIs in a single tag or multiple tag. So this way we have improved the OpenAPI specification documentation with the help of tags. So I hope you are clear, like whatever we have discussed inside this entire section. First we have discussed about common mark syntax, followed by examples, followed by tags. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload this version of the OpenAPI specification inside the GitHub. Please feel free to refer the same. The file name is displaying on your screen. So I hope this is all clear to you. Thank you and catch you in the next lecture. Bye. Now inside this section we are going to discuss about another root object inside OpenAPI, which is components. Like you can see, these are all the root objects inside OpenAPI. One is the OpenAPI, which we already discussed, info we discussed, servers we discussed, paths we discussed, and tags we already discussed. So with that we left with components, security, and external docs. So we're going to discuss one by one. So inside this section we are going to focus on components. So before I try to explain you what is the purpose of components, let's go back to our OpenAPI specification here. So here you can see there is a lot of duplicate details present inside our OpenAPI specification. For example, you can see for the get operation of orders, the parameter section, the input is order ID and it is of type query and the required is equal to true. The same parameter details we also used for delete as well. Like you can see, this entire parameter section is duplicated in two places. One is in the delete, the other one in the get operation of my orders. And similarly, at many positions, we also define these product object details. At many operations, we have defined the same structure again and again. So this increases the length of our OpenAPI specification. And also in future, if you want to change the structure of your products, or if you want to change the input parameter details that we have here, you may have to make sure you are changing in all the places where you have used. So this is a kind of not a good standard. So here we just have to follow a standard just like how we follow inside our programming languages. So think of a scenario inside your Java or Python or JavaScript program. You have a logic which is being repeated at multiple places. So what you are going to do is you will move that common business logic into a method or a function, and the same method and function you're going to use in all other places, so that in future whenever you want to change this business logic, you are going to change in a single place but not at the multiple places. So the same we are going to achieve with the help of components. So like you can see here, using components object, which is a root field inside your OpenAPI, we can define schemas, request body, responses, parameters. So once we define these details inside component, the same can be referenced inside your paths or operation object with the help of ref keyword. So like you can see here on the left hand side, there is a screenshot which is showing the root element components. So inside components, we can define multiple other objects like schemas, responses, parameters, request bodies. And under schemas or responses and parameters, you can again define multiple schema structures, multiple response structures, multiple parameter structure, and the same can be used inside your OpenAPI specification definitions with the help of $ref keyword. So on the right hand side, you can see, so with the help of components under schemas, I have created an schema of type object, and this schema name is address. And inside this object, I have properties like address line, city, state, zip code. So the same schema we can refer inside our OpenAPI specification document with the help of $ref followed by hash. And after the hash, you need to mention the component / schemas and what is the schema name. So the schema name here is address. So that's what I have mentioned inside the screenshot so that you have this as a reference in future. But don't worry, we are going to discuss about the implementation or sample examples with the help of components object in the next lecture. So with this, I am assuming you got some clarity about the purpose of the root object, which is components inside OpenAPI specification. Thank you, and I'll catch you in the next lecture. Bye. Now inside this lecture, let's try to solve the problem where we have duplicated the input parameters for orders API, like both in delete and get, we have this duplicate section. So what we can do is we can define a components of type parameters, and the same we can reference inside the delete and get operations. So for the same, what I can do here is I can go towards the end of this OpenAPI specification file, and I'm going to take this cursor towards the extreme left of this file so that I'm at a root position. Once I'm at to the extreme location, what I can do is I can define a object with the name components. Like I was telling before, under components, we can define schemas, parameters, request bodies, responses, and many other things. And since now we are interested in defining parameters details so that we can reuse that inside our APIs, so we just have to type the parameters here. And once we type these parameters, under parameters, you can define multiple parameters details. So if you have scenarios where the parameter details are being duplicated at multiple places inside your OpenAPI specification, you can define multiple parameter details under these parameters. So since we can define multiple parameters, for each parameter details, we have to give an unique name. So for the scenario that we are into, we are trying to define a parameter with the name order ID of type query. So the name that I can choose here is, so just after parameters, I have given tab space and I'm giving the name. I'll just mention order ID followed by query param. So this name always give a clue to me, like under these parameters, we are going to have some details around order ID, which accepts as a query param. So once we define an unique name, what we can do is we can give enter and tab space, and whatever details that we have here, like the name, in, required, schema type, so we can copy this entire content, and I'm going to paste the same value here. So once we define all these details like name, in, required, and schema type under this name, we can refer this parameter details inside our API. So I'm going to copy this name value that we have here, and I'll go to the one of the operation which is get method. So here first I need to mention $ref. So this is the syntax that I need to use whenever I want to refer something inside my components. Post that I can give double quotes, and I have to mention the hash. followed by forward slash. And now I have to mention the components, which is my root object name. After that, parameters. And after parameters, we have defined a parameter with the name order ID query param. So the similar thing I can do inside the delete operation also. So I'm going to remove all these lines and I'm going to replace this single line that we have, which is reference. And using reference, we are going to refer to this order ID query param which we have created here. So this way you can see we can avoid the duplicate configurations inside our OpenAPI specification, and this also brings one more advantage to us. Like in future, if I want to change something, like maybe I want to make it as an optional, so then in this scenario I can change only at a single place, and this can be reflected at all the places where I have reference to these parameters that I have defined inside my components. So if you go and observe the Swagger UI, there should not be any difference. So let me open these orders, and inside this order section we have this delete API, and you can see it is still showing the same like order ID which is of type required, and very similarly if you go to get also it is going to show the same. So this way we can use the components to create reusable parameters inside our OpenAPI specification. So inside the next lecture, let's try to understand how to build the reusable schemas with the help of components. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye.